So, hello everyone. This is my first video in English from the channel Divulga Humanas. It's a extension project from the Federal University of the Espírito Santo. And here I am with Professor Dr. Catherine Sear, who is a professor here in the University of Glasgow. So thanks, Dr. Sear, for accepting this invitation for our recording. And she's here to share with me, with us, some of her research interests, and one of them is oratory in the Roman Republic. Uh, so our last video, it's just a coincidence, was about Cicero, and she's here with us to speak about other orators from the Roman Republic besides Cicero. So, Cicero, could you talk about us? Why is it important to talk about other orators besides Cicero from the Roman Republic? Because he's our main source, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, all of classics is filling in the gaps and using material in the consciousness that a lot of other stuff that we would like to have has been lost. But that problem, that issue is particularly acute, I think, for Roman oratory, because we've got Cicero, as you say, we've got a huge amount of Cicero, but the only other speeches that we have that survive in a manuscript tradition from the imperial period. We've got Pliny's Panegyricus, and that's it. So all of the Republican orators, apart from Cicero, don't survive. And on the one hand, that's quite easy to understand. Cicero becomes canonical so fast and in such a dominant way that he is the author that aspiring orators want to read. And there's been a lot of really interesting work done recently about the way that Cicero becomes so dominant in the imperial schoolroom. Tom Keyline's work, Joseph Lebeau, and so on. So it's not difficult to understand why, but at the same time, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's one that has quite a few consequences, I think, both for literary studies and for historical studies. Now, I'm more interested, I think, in the historical implications of this, but it is worth just pausing to think about the literary implications for a moment. Because one of the things we simply can't do with Roman oratory is think about intertextuality, or we almost can't do it. We've got Cicero's works, but we have no real way of understanding how, if at all, he referred to earlier writers of speeches or wanted his own speeches to be understood in the context of earlier models. We know that Cicero was fascinated by the history of oratory at Rome. He wrote extensively about it in his first treatise, De Oratory. And of course, he wrote a history of oratory in his work, Brutus, which is effectively a catalogue of earlier orators. So he was extremely knowledgeable about and fascinated by the history of oratory. And it was an important history for him because it also allowed him to define himself as an orator and to explain why he was important, to explain how his education and his development and how he was connected to earlier orators. So it's hugely important for him. But all we've got to understand that is what Cicero himself says about it. We just don't, by and large, have the early material. So that's very frustrating. And anything we can do to try and fill in those gaps, I think, is valuable. But the other reason why it's so frustrating is that we know that public speech is absolutely vital to the political activity of the Roman Republic. I mean, it's central. The Contio, where politicians, particularly tribunes, talk to the people, argue for legislation that they think should be passed, is central to political activity and to the democratic aspect of Rome. And of course, debate in the Senate is really important as well. And the courts become, from the mid-2nd century BC onwards, a place where the behaviour of individual politicians is scrutinised. High level of accountability, because so many of the offences that are tried in the Quaestiones are effectively political offences: violence, bribery, treason, etc., etc. So forensic oratory is also significant politically. So if we can begin to put together a picture of who spoke in Rome, or we can develop that picture on the fragments that that exist and so on, we have a much better opportunity to understand the political history of the Republic.
Okay, so you just mentioned the existence of fragments. Could you talk more about the evidence that we have of other orators from Rome?
So yes, we have quite a lot of fragments. They're gathered together in Malcavati's edition. And there's also, very recently, Gesine Manowald edited the 3 volumes of the Lerb, fragments of Republican oratory. And there's quite a lot of material. Gellius quotes quite a lot. He's particularly interested in some of the 2nd century BC orators, so quotes quite a lot of Cato, quite a lot of the younger Gracchus, Gaius Gracchus. And the grammarians had access to texts of speeches, so we have quite a lot of small quotations, often because a word is interesting, so they can be rather frustrating fragments. They're very small, it's difficult to get context. But we've got that material. So we do have fragmentary material, but and I think this is a really important point. The only fragments we have, obviously, come from written texts. Okay. Now, we know that quite a lot of orators before Cicero wrote down texts of their speeches. And obviously there's the issue of the relationship between the text and the speech, which we can come back to later if we want to, but I think it's something of a side issue. We know that they were disseminating texts of what they said. Cato the Elder is absolutely the dominant figure in this, as so many other prose genres in Latin. We know lots of the titles of lots of speeches that he is supposed to have disseminated in written form. It's not always quite clear whether they circulated as independent texts or whether they were included in his historical writing, but he was a very active writer of speeches. And some other orators were also disseminating versions of what they'd said. Gaius Gracchus is the other very active disseminator of written speeches. I'm always a bit hesitant about the word published, but that's probably a little precious. Anyway, text circulating. And we know of other orators who also circulated 1 or 2, perhaps, of the speeches that they'd given, particularly significant events. But 2 points, I think, to make, first of all. The first is that even the orators who did disseminate written texts didn't necessarily, almost certainly didn't, do it for every speech that they gave. And that is, and a good check on that is actually Cicero's practice. I mean, he's hugely prolific as a writer of speeches, but even in his case, there were a lot of speeches that he delivered where we're pretty sure he didn't bother to put a text into circulation. And Crawford's lost and unpublished orations gathers the evidence for that. But the other thing is, a lot of orators never wrote down any of their speeches. And in fact, if you read the Brutus, Cicero sometimes in passing notes that. Right. So it's not a universal habit. So the net result of that is that there were a lot of speeches were delivered in Rome that were never recorded in writing. So it's no use looking for fragments of them because that just doesn't exist. But what we often do have is a record that the speech was given, and possibly even some information about what it was about or the arguments that might have been used. So we've got a very large body of testimonia about oratory. And that is why I think this is a slightly different genre in terms of looking at the stuff that wasn't recorded or has been lost, because we've got this dual form of recording. We've got texts, sure, we can have fragments of them, we can treat them like other lost texts which we can reconstruct, such as the historians, poetry, or whatever. But at the same time, we've got all this information about public speeches that never got written down, but they are just as important a source of evidence if we're trying to understand how public speech worked at Rome, even though they never became texts of the kind that you can then begin to think about in terms of a literary history and what was Cicero reading, and so on and so forth. So it's that dual form of evidence that I think is a particular challenge, but particularly interesting about oratory, and why I think there is still work to be done in this field, because we've got the fragments of the orators, but I don't think we've fully explored the research possibilities of the testimonial.
So you told about some pieces of evidence we have, but what can we do with this evidence? Because sometimes it feels so little just to know. Oh, I know that said orator gave some speeches, but what can we do as researchers?
What can we do? Yeah, it's a really good question, and it does depend on the nature of the evidence. And the orators for whom we can begin to actually analyse speeches, we can do it for some of the elder Cato. Okay. Only a few of them, really, but some of his speeches we've got enough that we can begin to think this is the argument that he used. We can do that for some of Gaius Gracchus. I mean, we've got some very substantial paragraph-length fragments that Gellius quotes that are very rich, I think. Beyond that, I mean, actually, if one wants to actually begin to grapple with what did a speech given by somebody other than Cicero look like, the best place really to do that is some of Cicero's own forensic oratory. I mean, Michael Alexander, I think, has blazed the trail here with that monograph, The Case for the Prosecution. Because what he does there is he analyses Cicero's defence speeches as a way of reconstructing the prosecution argument. And when you do that, you can actually go some way, I think, to looking at the techniques of other orators, and some really interesting things come out. I mean, I'll give you an example. Cicero's defence speech Pro Sulla, given in 62, defending a man who is accused de vi, and most of the charges related to alleged participation in the Catilinarian conspiracy. Okay. And it's an interesting speech, as we know, because Cicero's decision to take on the defence is clearly regarded as quite surprising. I mean, clearly he was quite surprising. This is the man who'd taken the lead in suppressing the Catilinarian conspiracy, and here he is popping up as the defender of a man who supposedly was part of the conspiracy. And we know, at least Gellius tells us, that Cicero's motive may have been connected with the very large loan that Sulla gave him to buy a nice house on the Palatine, etc., etc., etc. So we can do things with it in terms of Cicero's biography, obviously. But if you unpick the speech, it gives us a lot of information about what Torquatus, who was the prosecutor, brought in terms of arguments. And actually, it's very interesting because it shows us, I think, Torquatus doing what we're very familiar with from Cicero's, from other speeches of Cicero, and I think particularly of his prosecution of Ares. Okay, so some of what Torquatus says, and we have to reconstruct this from Cicero's defence, but it seems reasonable to think that if Cicero says Torquatus said in the context of a court, that's reasonably good evidence. So Torquatus, most of his charges related to things that Sulla was supposed to have done in 63, but he goes back earlier. He talks about violent behaviour that Sulla is supposed to have carried out in 66 and in 65. He uses arguments from character, etc., etc. So that's all quite an interesting way of saying, actually, the issues we have about relevance within Roman court, when we look at Cicero's practice, actually it's similar issues are happening with Torquatus's prosecution. So that's one thing, and of course, what Torquatus said at the trial and how Cicero responded seem to have been big elements in the whole fiction of the first Catilinarian conspiracy, in fact. So I think that's quite interesting. But the other thing that really struck me when I was looking at this recently was Torquatus wasn't the only member of the team prosecuting Sulla. He had a subscriptor, an assistant prosecutor, a man called Cornelius, about whom we know nothing. One of the commonest nomina in the Roman Republic, and we don't know his praenomen. All we know about him, other than that he was the subscriptor of this trial, was, and all the information comes from Cicero's Pro Sulla, is that his father had been one of the Catilinarian conspirators. And probably, I mean, he'd been certainly on trial earlier in 62 and probably been convicted. And what the subscriptor then does is he brings evidence to court from his father about Sulla's involvement. Fair enough. But what I think is possibly being, we can really push when we look at this, is that this seems to me to be a kind of genius move by Torquatus. Okay, Torquatus wants to prosecute Sulla. There's a history of hostility there. He sees his opportunity. There are rumours circulating that Sulla had been involved in the conspiracy. Lots of men are being convicted. He sees his chance. And then I'm hypothesising here, but what if we imagine that Torquatus goes out and finds the son of a convicted conspirator who's out for revenge? His father has faced penalties. He wants to see somebody else. He believes Sulla is guilty and he wants to attack Sulla. And then you have, actually, you can begin to speculate about Torquatus as putting together a case in a really kind of interesting but competent way. I mean, Cicero talks about Torquatus in speeches that he's completely incompetent. He shouts at times and then he's too quiet and he doesn't know how to do it and he doesn't realise that his arguments are confused and so on and so forth. But actually, once you begin sympathetically to try and reconstruct Torquatus, he actually seems to me to be a pretty effective operator who's put together some very powerful evidence against his the man he's going after, and is shaping an argument in a really interesting way. So that's one thing that we can do, and I think we can actually push that quite a bit. But as I say, apart from a few earlier orators whose speeches are recorded in paragraph-length chunks, the only time I think we can really do that is in these forensic contexts where we have Cicero's speech. Now, you might well come back to me and say, well, what about speeches in historiography? Mm-hmm. Because that is a big source of what looks like records of oratory. Livy, Sallust, they include often, I mean, particularly Sallust, quite substantial speeches, which, why can't we take them as evidence? Well, speeches in historiography are a really interesting problem. There's the convention that the historian himself writes the speech, that this is part of the literary artifact, and stylistically that is clearly the case. I think there is an interesting discussion to be had about the extent to which historians reproduce the arguments that they either knew or thought had been used in the speeches that they record. And there I think we can gain from having a less sceptical approach, or at least not saying, okay, they're all made up and therefore they tell us nothing. Within Livy's narrative, and I think also Sallust, the fact of the speech, I think, is a reasonably good data point. Mm-hmm. So I think we can be reasonably confident that as tribune designate in the autumn of 1112, Memmius does give a speech criticising the Senate's approach to negotiations with Jugurtha, and then again in 111 he gives contional speeches attacking the peace that's been negotiated. Whether we can place any confidence on what Sallust says Memmius says, and he does kind of give us a whole contional speech from 111, I think is much more difficult. Sallust is a particularly challenging case. How far is his view of popularis politics shaped by the post-Sullan world? Rosenblit has argued that it is. I think that's quite a strong argument. There are issues with that, but I think we can be reasonably confident that Memmius was a contional speaker during his tribunate. He did address the question of Jugurtha. He was hostile to the Senate, and maybe even he articulated that hostility using some of the tropes of a popularis history in the way that Sallust suggests that he did. There, I think, again, we need to take the evidence seriously. He doesn't have access. He doesn't have access to texts. Most of these aren't speeches that were written down. I mean, occasionally he does actually note that they were when he's talking about Cato. But a consul making the speech in the Senate that he wants to triumph, no, these weren't disseminated in written form. Livy is making the speech up. But I think what we know about his use of sources suggests that he did have good, credible evidence that the speech was delivered. And then you can think, well, okay, the details. We can't reconstruct the language. These aren't fragments, but we can perhaps be confident about the content in broad terms and certainly the fact of delivery and so on. So once you, and so to go back to your original question, well, what can we do with this? Well, one of the things we can do is actually map out oratorical activity and the kinds of things that people were talking about. And above all, I think one thing we have to bear in mind, I think this approach shows, is the absolute prevalence of public speech. Okay. Both its prevalence, but also I think the extent to which there is considerable individual choice in terms of what kind of a speaker you want to be. So, there are lots of occasions on which a magistrate has to speak. In a senatorial debate, if you're asked to speak, you have to say something. We kind of know that's a rule. So that's senators, not magistrates. And there are conventions within what magistrates do. So the convention that the presiding officer may give a report of a senatorial debate to the people outside immediately afterwards, and so on. So there are sort of formalised occasions at which if you're going to hold public office in Rome, you need to speak. And presumably, if you were completely incompetent, that would be noticed. And some of the material in the Brutus suggests that there were some completely incompetent speakers. But at the same time, the choice to give a speech in the sense that we might think about, an extended or shaped piece of public speech, that seems to be much more within the control of an individual. I mean, obviously, forensic activity is entirely at the discretion of the speaker. Defence advocates could turn people down if they wanted to, and obviously a prosecutor is somebody who chooses to bring a prosecution. So let's put forensic oratory on one side. There we know it's a matter of choice, though also there's an interesting intersection between choice and career, which we could come back to. But in terms of contionable or senatorial oratory, yes, you can be put in a position where you have no choice. And also remember that at public meetings, whoever summons them can bring people onto the platform and even hostilely cross-question them. And it looks as though people don't reject those invitations, even if they know they're going to get quite a hostile reception, which is interesting. But what you actually say, I mean, in the Senate, you're the presiding magistrate and you call on me to speak. Well, provided I'm not the very first person, I can just say I agree with so-and-so. It can be as simple as that. I don't have to give even a substantive response. Contionable oratory, yes, I might be produced, but again, when people are brought to a contio, very often it seems to be a matter of cross-questioning rather than lengthy speeches. Actually delivering a speech to a contio, well, either as a magistrate with the authority, you can call one and speak to it, or you can get somebody else and ask to be invited. But again, those are things within the volition of an individual. So we have this environment in which public speech is unavoidable, and therefore, basically, anybody who reaches at least one of the imperium holding magistrates is likely to have been put into a position where they need to speak. But at the same time, the decision to focus on oratory as part of your career, if you like, to make use of it, to be good at it, and then use it for whatever ends you want, lies with the individual. And of course, Henrietta van der Blom, in her book on oratory and political career, offers a series of case studies of individuals who do use oratory, and in very different ways. I mean, I think what she's shown is that oratory isn't a monolith, and that there are different ways of being good, effective orators at Rome.
So, do you think we can do something with the educational tests, like the declamations, for
Hmm.
instance?
Yes, that's an interesting point. I think some of the material that kind of pops up as potentially a testimonial or even a fragment may actually be declamatory in origin, because I mean, you know, there is this kind of fascinating temptation to become somebody else within oratorical education and think, well, what would it be like if I were Cicero, thinking about, you know, shall I burn my books? And then you get all the stuff that we find in the Elder Seneca. So I think that is a fruitful line to be pursued. Um, it does at least, I think, show us a bit about how orators were transmitted within the educational system. Of course, as soon as you start looking in detail, it becomes apparent that Cicero is already dominant by the early empire. Um, so how far it can be helpful for orators other than Cicero, I don't know. But here's an example, though actually it may well be historiographical rather than declamatory. One of the one of the really kind of most exciting fragments of late Republican oratory is a paragraph that's preserved in Valerius Maximus by a man who's called Helvius Mancia. I don't know whether you know this passage. It's the one which preserves that phrase describing Pompey as an adolescentless carnifexia. You know, and the context, according to Valerius Maximus, is a hearing in front of the censors, um, and uh, Helvius Mancia pops up to attack Pompey, and I mean it's a wonderful piece of writing. But as soon as you drill down into the context, it's very difficult indeed to see under what circumstances Helvius Mancia himself might have produced a text. And as a result, it seems much more likely that whatever Valerius Maximus thought he was doing, he got the quote, I mean, the text he was accessing was something other than an independently circulating um, text of a speech in Pompeium, or whatever it might have been called, that Mancia might have disseminated. So that's an interesting example where the reconstruction oratory or the imaginative recording of oratory may well be coming into our sources. And you know, I don't think it's a fragment. I don't think we can treat it as a fragment if we define as an oratorical fragment, as I think we have to do, something, you know, a piece of text that comes from a text circulated by the speaker himself as an independent speech. So that's one kind of interesting case, I think, where we need, as soon as you begin to kind of think about the circumstances of the production of the text, it becomes more complicated than it might at first sight seem.
All right. So, are there like other kinds of evidence that we would like to highlight or to talk about before we end the video?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've talked about historical writing, which is a very important source, and um, the direct recording of fragmentary material. I mean, Cicero's letters are a hugely important source of oratory from from the period certainly the 50s. And again, that's mostly, I mean, that's not fragments. Okay? He's not quoting other people's speeches, but he's talking about the speeches that people have given. So there's a lot of information about forensic activity and who's prosecuting whom and who's defending whom and so on. But there are also some nice bits telling us about senatorial debate, actually. I mean, obviously, there's the famous Altecatio he has of Clodius after Clodius's acquittal, that's recorded in a letter to Atticus. But also, there's quite a bit about senatorial procedure, a lot of it from the letters to Quintus, actually, in which Cicero seems more comfortable about talking about the details of Senate practice, one senator from another, than he is to Atticus. So, for example, the early weeks of 56, where the Senate is much occupied with the Egyptian question, should they send an army? You can construct senatorial debate and who is speaking at the debates on a daily basis, really, from those letters. And again, the individual the individual occasions. Well, okay, Hortensia spoke in support of this motion. Okay, what does that? How much further does that get us on? But if you put it together, you actually get quite an interesting picture of in which you can see which of the consulars who are contributing, what side are they on, and the kind of detail of progress over a period, and the very cumbersome processes of the Senate, in fact, at that period. So that's one thing one can do a lot about, but of course that's really only for the 50s. And another source actually that we shouldn't forget, partly because he's such a weird source, and I say it not in a derogatory sense, but just because he really is one of a kind, is Asconius. I mean, his commentaries on the 5 speeches of Cicero, where the commentaries 5, and we know he wrote quite a lot more, are such a mine of evidence for late Republican political practice. Again, he's not really he's not primarily interested in oratory per se, and that's one of the really interesting things I think about the nature of his commentary, because it's not really a linguistically focused commentary. I mean, he's not talking about Cicero's style. He's trying to make it comprehensible, these speeches, to kind of an educated audience who may not have at their fingertips the historical details. But what Asconius tells us about forensic practice is hugely important, and again really helpful for the process of reconstructing what Cicero's opponents said. So to revert to that point, that actually is a very productive way of getting at non-Ciceronian oratory. Asconius, for the material he does cover, is a very helpful addition there.
Okay, so well, thank you again, Dr. Sue, for accepting this invitation. I think it was really helpful to develop notions of the studies of Roman oratory in general, and also how to approach different kinds of historical sources. So it was really good. Now, just to end the video, is there any piece of work of yours or any particular project that you would like to share with the audience? Something like this?
Everything that I've been talking about is part of a project that I've been running for far too long now. If I had been in an ideal world, I would have finished it before now. That was funded by the European Research Council between 2012 and 2017, precisely to gather this material about the fragmentary orators of the Roman Republic. So that work is ongoing, but I hope is reaching a conclusion and hopefully will be published at some point in the not too distant future.
Okay, looking forward to seeing this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again.